Don't close your eyes, Eli. Look at me. Logan roared over the deafening shriek of the blizzard, his voice cracking. He gripped the boy's freezing shoulders, desperate to stave off the lethal sleep of hypothermia. Beside them, Koda, a seasoned combat Malinois, whined frantically, pawing at the shattered floorboards of the abandoned cabin. The chimney is blocked, Logan. If we light the fire, the smoke will kill us. Mia screamed, her lips blue, trembling violently. Logan's SEAL training kicked into overdrive. Conventional survival rules were dead. He looked at the snow pouring through the collapsed roof. No fire, Logan ordered, his eyes locking onto Koda. We're going to build a cave. Right here. The barometric pressure plummeted so fast it made Logan's ears pop. He paused on the steep incline of the Bitterroot timberline, adjusting the straps of his heavy rucksack, and looked up at the bruised, violent sky. The slate-gray clouds were moving with terrifying speed, swallowing the jagged peaks in a rolling wall of white. This wasn't just a winter flurry. It was a freak meteorological phenomenon known among locals as a white death. A massive, fast-moving front, capable of dropping 3 feet of snow in a matter of hours, accompanied by hurricane-force winds. Logan, a retired Navy SEAL who had spent a decade operating in some of the most unforgiving environments on Earth, recognized the lethal shift in the atmosphere instantly. The air didn't just feel cold, it felt heavy, carrying the distinct, metallic scent of ozone and pulverized ice. At his side, Koda let out a low, rumbling whine. The Belgian Malinois, a veteran of multiple overseas deployments, was highly attuned to environmental shifts. Koda's ears were pinned back against his skull, and his muscular frame was tense. His amber eyes locked onto the advancing wall of white. "I know, buddy," Logan muttered, his breath pluming in thick white clouds that were instantly snatched away by the rising wind. "We're in a bad spot." They had ventured out for a routine 3-day backcountry trek, a way for Logan to burn off the restless energy that always haunted him in the civilian world. He carried a comprehensive survival kit, but no one packed for an apocalypse on a Tuesday hike. As the first agonizingly sharp flakes began to sting his exposed cheeks like shattered glass, Logan had to make an immediate tactical decision. Conventional wilderness wisdom dictated descending into the valley to seek shelter, but Logan's specialized winter warfare training taught him a hidden truth. Valleys in these conditions act as deadly terrain traps. As katabatic winds poured down the mountain, pooling sub-zero air below, the valley floor would become an unsurvivable freezer and a natural funnel for inevitable avalanches. To survive, Logan had to do the exact opposite of what his instincts screamed. He had to climb higher. He needed to reach the secondary ridgeline, a wind-scoured plateau where the snow wouldn't accumulate deep enough to bury them, and where he might find the ruins of an old, legendary logging camp he had seen on topographical maps. "Up we go, Koda. Push," Logan commanded, his voice already muffled by the howling gale. The ascent was a grueling, agonizing test of human endurance. Within 30 minutes, the world was entirely erased. There was no sky, no ground, no horizon, only a chaotic, blinding vortex of screaming white. The wind velocity increased exponentially, hitting them with concussive force that threatened to knock Logan off his feet. Every step required monumental effort, lifting his boots through thigh-deep, rapidly accumulating powder. His thighs burned with lactic acid, and his lungs seared with every intake of the frigid, razor-sharp air. Koda took the lead, utilizing his innate canine mechanics to break the trail. The dog's thick, double-layered coat was already heavily caked with rime ice, giving him the appearance of a spectral wolf. Despite the punishing conditions, Koda pushed forward with the relentless, stoic drive bred into his bloodline. Logan kept his eyes glued to the dog's tail, using it as his sole visual anchor in the sensory deprivation chamber of the blizzard. Time lost all meaning. It could have been 2 hours or 5. Logan's core temperature was beginning its slow, insidious drop. He could feel the blood shunting away from his extremities, pooling in his chest to protect his vital organs. His fingers and toes were transitioning from a painful burning sensation to a terrifying heavy numbness. He knew the clinical stages of hypothermia intimately. Stage 1 was shivering. He was shivering violently now, his teeth chattering with enough force to crack enamel. If they didn't find shelter before Stage 2 set in, when the shivering stops and the profound confusion begins, they were going to die on this slope, buried and forgotten until the spring thaw. Just as the creeping lethargy of the cold began to whisper sweet, deadly promises of rest in Logan's mind, Koda stopped. The dog didn't just pause. He planted his paws firmly in the snow, his entire body rigid, and let out a sharp, percussive bark that was nearly swallowed by the wind. Logan stumbled forward, wiping the frozen slush from his eyelashes. He squinted into the impenetrable whiteout. At first, he saw nothing. Then, a massive, dark geometric shape materialized out of the swirling chaos, standing in stark contrast to the surrounding natural environment. It was the cabin. It was an imposing, decaying structure built from massive, hand-hewn timber logs, leaning precariously against the relentless force of the wind. Half the roof had already caved in beneath the weight of years of neglect and heavy snowpack, and the windows were nothing more than jagged, empty maws staring blindly into the storm. It was a ruin, a ghost of the logging era, but it was a break in the wind. It was a chance at life. "Good boy, Koda," Logan gasped, his voice barely a rasp. He pushed his exhausted muscles into a final, desperate sprint toward the dark silhouette, unaware that the true challenge of the night was only just beginning. The wind battered Logan's back, physically shoving him toward the weathered structure. He threw his weight against the heavy, splintered oak door. It didn't budge. Years of structural settling and thick frozen ice had sealed it shut. Logan stepped back, grimaced through the pain in his frozen feet, and delivered a brutal, specialized front kick directly adjacent to the rusted iron handle. The freezing wood groaned, snapped, and the door violently burst open inward. Logan and Koda spilled into the darkness of the cabin, instantly enveloped by the shocking, dead silence that contrasted the roaring tempest outside. Logan quickly slammed the broken door shut behind them, wedging a piece of fallen timber against it to keep the wind out. The interior of the cabin was a desolate time capsule. The air was stagnant, smelling heavily of damp rot, ancient pine pitch, and decades of accumulated dust. Snow had drifted into the corners through the shattered windows and the massive hole in the collapsed roof. The ambient temperature inside was barely warmer than outside, hovering dangerously below zero. But the sheer relief of escaping the wind chill was a massive psychological victory. Logan dropped his heavy pack, his chest heaving as he pulled off his ice-caked gloves. He needed to establish a perimeter, assess the structural integrity of the remaining roof, and begin the immediate process of generating heat. "All right, Koda," Logan muttered, pulling a heavy-duty tactical flashlight from his chest rig and clicking it on. The brilliant white beam pierced the gloom, illuminating dust motes dancing in the freezing air. "Let's secure the space." But Koda wasn't acting like a dog who had just found refuge from a deadly storm. Instead of shaking the ice from his coat and curling into a tight ball to conserve heat, the Malinois was hyper-animated. His nose was pressed hard against the floorboards, sweeping back and forth in frantic, rapid sniffs. He moved with a predatory intensity, ignoring the massive stone fireplace at the far end of the room. Koda stopped dead in the center of the cabin. He looked up at Logan, let out a sharp, distinct bark, and began furiously digging at the solid wood floor with his heavy front paws. Logan's brow furrowed. That specific sequence of behaviors, the hyper-focus, the sharp bark, the aggressive scratching, wasn't a random canine quirk. It was Koda's trained alert signal. It was the exact behavior he exhibited in combat zones when he detected human life hidden beneath rubble. "What do you have, buddy?" Logan asked, his voice tightening with sudden tension. He drew his sidearm out of pure muscle memory, his SEAL instincts shifting him instantly from survival mode to tactical assessment. The cabin was supposed to be abandoned for 50 years. He approached the center of the room and shone the flashlight down. The floorboards here looked exactly like the rest of the cabin, heavy, interlocking planks of rough-hewn oak. But as Logan knelt, feeling the wood with his bare, freezing hands, he noticed a subtle anomaly. There was a hairline gap, perfectly straight, forming a square in the timber. It wasn't just a floor. It was a concealed hatch, and wedged tightly into the gap, covered in dust, was a heavy, rusted iron pull ring, completely flush with the wood. Logan holstered his weapon, grabbed the iron ring, and pulled. It was locked solid, frozen by time and ice. He dug into his survival kit, extracted a titanium pry bar, and jammed it into the seam. He threw his entire body weight backward, grunting with exertion. There was a loud, cracking sound like a gunshot as the ice seal broke, and the heavy trapdoor groaned open, revealing a pitch-black square of nothingness below. A wave of utterly foul, freezing air wafted up from the hole. But underneath the smell of earth and rot, Logan heard something that made his blood run cold. It was a sound so faint it was nearly imperceptible over the howling wind outside. A rhythmic, wheezing gasp. Logan immediately positioned himself over the hole, shining the high-lumen beam directly down into the abyss. It was an old root cellar, lined with crumbling stone, perhaps 10 feet deep. The beam cut through the darkness and illuminated a horrific scene. Huddled in the corner of the freezing, damp dirt floor, covered in a thin layer of fallen debris from the rotten ceiling, were two teenagers. They were clutching each other in a desperate, tangled ball, their clothes lightweight, cotton hiking gear entirely inappropriate for the environment, were soaked through and caked in frozen mud. "Hey," Logan barked, his voice echoing in the chamber. "Can you hear me?" The older one, a girl who looked no older than 17, slowly turned her head toward the blinding light. Her face was a terrifying mask of hypothermia. Her skin was ashen, her lips a bruised, ghastly purple, and her eyes were severely unfocused, pupils dilated to the absolute maximum. The boy wrapped in her arms, perhaps 12 years old, wasn't moving at all. We fell," the girl managed to whisper, her voice slurring heavily, a classic symptom of severe neurological impairment due to cold. The floor broke, couldn't get back up. Logan didn't waste another second. He grabbed a length of paracord from his pack, anchored it to a sturdy structural beam, and rapidly rappelled into the cellar. The temperature down here was arguably worse than above. It was a damp, subterranean cold that cut straight to the bone. He dropped to his knees beside them, pulling off his gloves to press 2 fingers against the boy's carotid artery. The pulse was there, but it was thready, erratic, and frighteningly slow. Logan pinched the skin on the back of the boy's hand. It stayed tented. Rigid, the capillary refill was dangerously slow. "What are your names?" Logan demanded, keeping his voice sharp and loud, attempting to shock the girl's fading brain into alertness. He began rapidly brushing the freezing dirt off their bodies. "Mia," the girl mumbled, her eyes rolling back slightly. "He's Eli. We were just hiking to the storm." They were in the late stages of stage 2 hypothermia, bordering on stage 3, the terminal phase. Their bodies had exhausted their energy reserves for shivering, meaning they were no longer generating any internal heat. Their core temperatures were plummeting toward 85 degrees Fahrenheit. If they dropped any lower, they would go into irreversible cardiac arrest. Logan looked up at the square of dim light above, then back at the freezing children. He had found them, but the real nightmare was just beginning. He had to get them out of this hole, and he had to do something drastic, because they were minutes away from dying in his arms. Logan hoisted Eli over his shoulder in a fireman's carry, ignoring the screaming protests of his own exhausted muscles, and scrambled up the steep, crumbling dirt wall of the cellar, using the paracord. He laid the unconscious boy gently on the cabin floor, then immediately dropped back down to haul Mia up. Koda paced frantically around them, whimpering, nudging Eli's motionless face with his warm snout. Once both teenagers were above ground, the grim reality of their situation settled heavily over the room. The cabin offered a barrier against the wind, but it was essentially a massive, freezing wooden box. The ambient temperature was easily 20 below zero, and the gaping hole in the roof was allowing a steady cascade of snow to pile up on the floor. Mia collapsed next to her brother, her hands curling inward like rigid claws. "Fire," she mumbled, her slurred words barely decipherable. "Please, make fire." The fireplace. Logan turned his flashlight toward the massive, imposing stone hearth taking up the far wall of the cabin. It was fully stocked with decades-old, bone-dry timber, expertly stacked by whoever had abandoned the place. It was a survivalist's dream. The natural, instinctual response, the conventional wisdom pounded into every human brain since the dawn of time was to immediately light a massive, roaring fire to blast heat into the room and warm the dying children. Logan grabbed a piece of fatwood and approached the hearth. He shone his light up into the dark throat of the stone chimney. He froze. The chimney wasn't just blocked, it was catastrophically sealed. Decades of heavy bird nests, collapsed masonry, and a solid, impenetrable plug of black ice completely choked the flue. Logan's mind raced. If he lit that dry wood, the fire would ignite brilliantly, but the smoke would have nowhere to vent. More importantly, a large fire in this sealed, compacted space would rapidly consume oxygen and flood the low-floor area with massive, lethal amounts of invisible carbon monoxide. Lighting that fire wouldn't save them. It would asphyxiate all of them within 15 minutes. The chimney is blocked, Logan. If we light the fire, the smoke will kill us. Mia suddenly screamed. A brief, terrifying spike of adrenaline piercing her cold-induced stupor. She had seen the blockage too. If we don't, the cold will, she sobbed, clutching her brother desperately. Logan's SEAL training kicked into overdrive. The conventional survival rules were dead. He had to pivot. He recalled a brutal winter warfare. SEER. Survival, evasion, resistance, and escape. Training module in the Arctic Circle. The instructors had hammered a hidden survival truth into their frozen skulls. In extreme cold, an open room is your enemy. You cannot heat the air, you must trap the body. Space is the killer of warmth. No fire, Logan ordered, his voice cutting through the panic with absolute, unwavering authority. He locked eyes with Koda. We're gonna build a cave. Right here. He turned back to the teenagers. Listen to me, Mia. I need you to do exactly what I say, right now. Take off your jackets. Take off your shirts. Strip down to your base layers. Mia stared at him, horror registering through her confusion. No. It's too cold. We'll die. It was the ultimate counterintuitive paradox of survival. To a freezing brain, removing layers feels like an immediate death sentence, but Logan knew the lethal truth. Their cotton clothes were soaked with freezing mud and snowmelt. Water conducts heat away from the body 25 times faster than air. As long as they wore that wet cotton, it acted as a terrifyingly efficient refrigeration system, sucking the last remaining degrees of life from their core. Your clothes are killing you. Take them off. Logan roared, stepping forward and physically grabbing the zipper of Eli's soaked jacket, ripping it down. He rapidly stripped the unconscious boy out of his freezing heavy layers, leaving him in only his damp thermal underwear. He tossed the stiff, freezing garments across the room, reluctantly, sobbing with terror and cold. Mia fumbled with numb fingers and did the same. Logan moved with terrifying speed. He didn't try to heat the room. He began to destroy it. He grabbed a massive, heavy wooden dining table sitting in the corner and violently flipped it onto its side, pushing it against the solid, intact corner of the cabin walls. He had just created a tiny, enclosed right triangle, a microspace. He unzipped his pack and pulled out the crown jewel of his cold weather kit, a specialized heavy-duty Mylar space blanket, and a Sub-Zero mummy-style sleeping bag. He didn't put the kids inside the bag yet. First, he draped the large reflective Mylar blanket entirely over the overturned table, creating a metallic tent that hung down to the floor. Then, he grabbed the heavy, dust-caked woven rugs from the cabin floor and threw them over the Mylar, but it wasn't enough. Insulation requires trapped air, and the ambient temperature was still deadly. Logan did the unthinkable. He ran to the center of the room, grabbed double armfuls of the dry, powdery snow blowing in through the roof, and began packing it heavily against the outside of the rugs and the table. "What are you doing?" Mia cried out, shivering so hard her teeth were clicking audibly. "Snow is an insulator," Logan grunted, rapidly packing a thick wall of white powder around their makeshift structure. "It's full of trapped air. It's how igloos work. We are building a thermal barrier between us and the room." Once the microclimate shell was fortified, Logan spread his thick, dry sleeping bag directly onto the wooden floorboards inside the tiny triangular space beneath the table. "Get in," Logan ordered Mia. "Get Eli in the bag with you." Mia crawled under the low ceiling of the table, dragging her brother's limp body into the down-filled sleeping bag. "Koda, here," Logan commanded. The massive Malinois didn't hesitate. He crawled into the tiny space, wedging his 70-pound, muscular body directly against the children. A dog's normal body temperature is naturally higher than a human's, sitting at a steady 101.5 to 102.5 degrees Fahrenheit. In a confined space, a working dog is a biological furnace. Finally, Logan stripped off his own freezing outer layers, down to his dry tactical thermals, and wedged his broad shoulders into the opening of their microcave, completely sealing them in. He pulled the heavy rugs and Mylar down tight behind him, eliminating any gap where air could escape. Instantly, the world plunged into absolute pitch-black darkness. The howling of the blizzard was muffled, reduced to a heavy, distant roar. They were trapped in a space no larger than a dog kennel, buried under a table, rugs, and snow, inside a collapsing cabin. Now, there was nothing left to do but wait, and pray that the physics of human heat were stronger than the wrath of the mountain. The darkness inside the micro-shelter was absolute, heavy, and suffocating. But within the first 20 minutes, a miraculous, physiological shift began to occur. In a large room, the minuscule amount of heat generated by their three bodies would have dissipated instantly into the vast, freezing air. But trapped inside the tiny triangular space beneath the table, constrained by the heavy rugs and the thick packing of insulating snow, the thermodynamics completely reversed. The mylar blanket acting as the inner roof of their cave immediately began reflecting their combined radiant body heat directly back down onto them. Koda, curled tightly against Eli's chest, was operating like a massive, living radiator, his rapid breathing pumping hot, 102-degree air into the confined space. Logan's massive frame blocked the only exit, his own intense body heat contributing to the microclimate. "Logan," Mia whispered into the pitch black. Her voice was weak, but the terrifying slur of severe hypothermia was beginning to fade. It's getting warm. Don't move," Logan replied softly, his voice a steady, grounding anchor in the dark. "Keep your skin touching your brother. Skin-to-skin contact is the fastest way to transfer core heat. Let the dog do the work." Outside their tiny sanctuary, the storm unleashed its ultimate fury. The barometric pressure bottomed out, and the wind velocity reached catastrophic speeds. Through the thick insulation of their snow-packed walls, Logan could hear the cabin groaning in agony. The massive timber joists shrieked as they were twisted by the gale. Crack! A deafening explosion of sound ripped through the night as the remainder of the cabin's heavy roof finally gave way, collapsing into the center of the room they had just evacuated. The impact shook the floorboards beneath them violently, sending a shower of dust and splinters raining down on their mylar ceiling. If Logan had chosen the conventional route, if they had stayed by the fireplace trying to light a fire, they would have been crushed instantly by thousands of pounds of frozen timber and snow. Mia gasped, burying her face into Koda's fur. The dog let out a low, reassuring rumble from deep within his chest, holding his ground perfectly. "We're secure," Logan lied smoothly, projecting absolute calm despite knowing their table could buckle if a main support beam hit it directly. "The structure over us is reinforced. Focus on your breathing." To keep their minds active and monitor their cognitive recovery, Logan forced them into conversation. He became a voice in the dark, asking them relentless questions. He learned that Eli and Mia had ventured off the main trail chasing a stray dog, got turned around in the sudden whiteout, and sought shelter in the cabin, only to fall through the rotted floorboards in the dark. As the hours dragged on, the most agonizing phase of survival began, the return of sensation, as their core temperatures stabilized and blood began to painfully shunt back into their extremities. Eli finally woke up. The boy didn't wake up peacefully. He woke up screaming, "My hands, my feet, they're burning." Eli thrashed wildly inside the sleeping bag, kicking at the tight confines of their shelter. It was a phenomenon mountaineers morbidly referred to as the screaming barfies, the excruciating, burning agony of frozen nerves firing back to life as warm blood flooded the capillaries. "Hold him, Mia," Logan commanded, having to use his own weight to pin the boy's legs so he wouldn't kick down their delicate structural walls. "It hurts, Eli. I know. It means you're alive. The tissue is surviving. Fight through it." It was a hellish, claustrophobic nightmare. Trapped in a pitch-black box, listening to the agonizing screams of a child, while a hurricane dismantled the world above them. Logan focused entirely on the rhythm of Koda's breathing, using the dog's steady, stoic presence to keep his own rising anxiety in check. He drew on every reserve of mental fortitude he had forged in BUD/S training, becoming the immovable pillar of strength the teenagers needed. Slowly, agonizingly, the screaming subsided into exhausted whimpers. The internal temperature of their micro-cave had risen to a staggering 60 degrees Fahrenheit, fueled entirely by biological heat and trapped air, while the ambient temperature outside plummeted to 40 below zero. They had successfully built an incubator in the middle of an ice age. Time stretched into an unmeasurable void. Eventually, the deafening roar of the wind began to pitch downward, transitioning from a freight train shriek to a low, hollow moan. The violent shaking of the floorboard ceased. Then Logan heard it. Faint, rhythmic, and mechanical. Thwack, thwack, thwack. The distinct, heavy beat of a search and rescue helicopter rotor cutting through the thin mountain air. Logan slammed his shoulder against the overturned table, shoving the heavy rugs and snow aside. The brilliant, blinding light of the morning sun pierced the gloom, forcing him to shield his eyes. He crawled out of the collapsed micro-shelter and stood up. The sight was staggering. The cabin was utterly obliterated. The walls had been blown out, and the massive stone chimney had partially collapsed inward, burying the hearth where they would have otherwise been sitting. They were standing in the middle of a frozen, splintered ruin, surrounded by 3 feet of fresh powder. Hovering 50 feet above the tree line, a bright orange Coast Guard Jayhawk helicopter kicked up a massive cloud of snow downwash. The side door was open, and a rescue medic was staring down at the wreckage through binoculars. Logan could see the medic lowering the optics, his body language sagging with defeat. The rescuers were looking at a destroyed, unsurvivable debris field. They thought they were on a body recovery mission. Logan stepped out from under the broken timber, a massive, imposing figure in the pristine white snow. He reached down to his chest rig, pulled an emergency high-visibility orange signal panel, and waved it violently in the air. Koda bounded out of the wreckage beside him, barking triumphantly at the massive metal bird in the sky. The helicopter instantly banked hard, maneuvering for a winch drop. 20 minutes later, a heavily geared rescue medic dropped into the snow beside Logan. The medic frantically assessed the scene, looking from the destroyed, snow-filled cabin to the 2 teenagers sitting wrapped in a sleeping bag, pale, but very much alive. The medic looked at the collapsed chimney, the untouched pile of dry firewood, and then at the tiny snow-covered table fort huddled in the corner. He pushed his goggles up, his eyes wide with absolute disbelief. You didn't build a fire?" The medic stammered, looking at Logan as if he were a ghost. "In -40 wind chill? We clocked the ambient drop. You should be frozen solid." Logan reached down, giving Koda a rough, affectionate scratch behind the ears. He looked at Eli and Mia, who were drinking hot tea from the medic's thermos, smiling for the first time in 24 hours. Fire in an open room just burns the oxygen and lets the heat escape, Logan said quietly, his voice raspy but steady. "We didn't need a fire. We just needed to shrink the world. Sometimes, the instincts we trust, like building a massive fire or relying on the sturdy walls of a large room, are exactly what will get us killed." Logan's unconventional choice proved that in extreme conditions, survival isn't about fighting the elements with brute force. It's about adapting, shrinking your world, and sharing the raw warmth of life. The bond between a hardened operator, 2 terrified teenagers, and a devoted dog turned a frozen tomb into a sanctuary. If Logan and Koda's incredible fight for survival resonated with you, please hit that like button, share this story with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more true-to-life tales of courage and resilience in the wild. Stay safe out there.